In Japan's corporate world, a chilling reality looms, the phenomenon of black companies. These exploitative organizations thrive on overwork, unpaid wages, and harassment. Imagine a workplace where supervisors hurl threats like, "I'm gonna kill you," and even attempting to resign invites intimidation and power harassment. These are not isolated anecdotes. They are the grim reality for many Japanese workers trapped in these toxic environments. I will now share a short video from the TikTok account Salaryman Tokyo, which will give you a brief idea of the pressure employees are under. You can find him on Instagram as well. The Ministry of Health, Labour and Welfare, while not officially defining black companies, identifies common traits as extreme overtime and unattainable quotas, rampant unpaid wages and pervasive power harassment, a culture of exploitation under harsh conditions resulting in high turnover rates. Highlighting the scope of the crisis, the Black Company Map documents over 1,000 companies prosecuted for labor law violations, yet these companies persist, supported by societal and economical structures that allow their abuses to go unchecked. The toll is severe. Many workers suffer physical and mental harm, with karoshi, death by overwork, a stark reminder of the ultimate cost. Victims of karoshi succumb to heart attacks, strokes, or suicide after enduring relentless pressure. One infamous case is that of Mina Mori, a 26-year-old employee of the Watami restaurant chain, forced to work over 140 hours of overtime per month. Her mental health deteriorated rapidly. She tragically took her own life just 2 months into her employment. The ensuing investigation revealed numerous labor violations, ultimately forcing Watami to pay 130 million yen or $1.1 million as a settlement and issue a public apology. In this video, I will take you deep into the underbelly of Japan, sharing chilling stories from black companies, from paranormal sightings of spirits haunting oppressive workplaces to cursed objects like second-hand laptops, sinister cover-ups, devastating fires, and overall the callousness of those in charge who perpetuate this toxic culture. Prepare to uncover the dark and haunting realities of these corporate nightmares. These are Japan's black companies. Please like, share, and subscribe. Here's the bells. June 25, 2021. This is a true story that I experienced while working at a factory a few years ago. I want to share it, even though it's one of the scariest and most unsettling things that has ever happened to me. I used to work on the second floor of a factory. One day I heard the blaring sound of a fire alarm echoing throughout the building. It wasn't a fire drill. I don't think we ever had a fire drill, come to think of it. This didn't feel like a test. This felt urgent, terrifying. I remember thinking, I have to get out of here, and I immediately ran towards the west staircase, hoping to find a way out. But to my horror, the massive iron shutter doors were coming down, inches from the floor, sealing off the exit. I panicked and turned to run to the east staircase, but found that one blocked off too by another set of iron shutters. The entire second floor was on lockdown. All of us factory employees were struck with the realization that we were stuck inside. Then the factory's intercom crackled to life, a voice of an official, echoing throughout the building, cold and distant, said, "A fire has broken out on the first floor near the soldering tank. The chemicals from the fire neutralizing agent could contaminate the products on the second floor. We will spray the neutralizer once the fire has been extinguished. Until then, all employees on the second floor are to stay where they are and wait for further instructions." There was a brief period of silence, and then, as if to make it perfectly clear, the speakers crackled, and the voice was back to say, "I repeat, stay where you are and await further instructions." 40 minutes passed. The smell of burning plastic, metal, and something else, something almost metallic, filled the air. We could hear screams, shouting, and panicking coming from below. The sound of flames crackling was unbelievably unnerving, a constant reminder that we were trapped with the flames just beneath our feet. Every so often, a muffled voice from a colleague would shout for help, but it was quickly drowned out by the noises of panic and the sound of flickering flames. I cannot really put into words how terrifying it was. I just remember looking at the iron shutters and pleading internally that they would open and let us all out. I wanted to run. I wanted to escape so badly, but the orders were clear. Someone went to open a window, and our shop floor manager yelled at him to stop. "Don't open the windows, don't make a sound. The products will be damaged by the firefighting chemicals. We must protect the quality of the products at all costs." They had told us to hold out, and we did, even as the temperature in the room started to rise. My heart pounded in my chest. The constant sound of the fire alarm felt like it was tearing at my sanity. The whole time I was thinking, why? Why is this happening? This couldn't be normal. This company has always been strict, but now we were being asked to risk our life for their products? After what felt like an eternity, the iron shutters finally started to lift. They told us we could leave, but by that point, it had been over an hour. I was shaken, but I followed the others, my legs feeling as if they were made of lead. As I stepped out into the fresh air, even the cool breeze couldn't calm me down. It only made me more aware of how close I had come to something fatal. The flames, the smoke, the screams, they lingered in my mind long after I left the building. That was the moment I decided to quit. The pay was low, the conditions were worse than I had ever imagined, and I hated the expectation that we would work overtime without question. But the real reason I left was that I couldn't stand working for a company that treated its employees like that. The fear, the confusion, the absolute indifference to our safety made me sick. After I left, I moved to a quieter job, one where I didn't have to worry about small things like being trapped in a burning building. But even now, I think about those days. That factory was a revolving door of employees, people coming and going, burned out, overworked, and treated like disposable tools. Sometimes I still dream about what happened. I can still smell the smoke, hear the screams, and feel the terror of being trapped inside a burning building. Was it just me, or was this something that happened all the time in these black companies? Were they really that evil? I told myself I was being too dramatic. It was just a workplace accident, right? But that was no normal company. It was a black company, one where employee welfare meant nothing. A company where profits came first, no matter the cost. And I couldn't stop wondering how many more people had suffered there. The company didn't care about us. They didn't care about anything but pushing forward, making their products. And I couldn't help but wonder how many of us had already been reduced to nothing more than disposable parts in their machinery. One of the strangest things about the whole experience is that, even though the fire was a major incident, the factory is still up and running. It's still operational. It's been years since that day. I heard they even opened up another factory in China not long ago, expanding their operations overseas. But the building I worked in, the one where the fire happened, it should have never been allowed to exist. The fire department should have condemned the building long ago. The structure was dangerous, riddled with violations, no doubt, but somehow the company kept everything under wraps, hiding their negligence, sweeping it all under the rug. They had the paperwork to make it look fine. But underneath it all, there was nothing but corruption and disregard for safety. I still think about my colleagues who worked there. I can't help but wonder where they are now, if they moved on to other jobs or if they're still stuck, still toiling away in that hellhole. I don't think anyone died in that fire, thank God. I'm just glad I made it out. But for those who didn't, and for those still working there, I can only hope they find a way to escape before it's too late. This is a story about something that happened when I was 22, working at a company. It still haunts me to this day, and I can't shake the feeling that something dark was happening beneath the surface at that place. Back then I was a programmer at a company that published job listings. I worked a rotating 2-shift system, and everything was just normal, or so I thought. One morning at work I had an unbelievable headache. The kind of pain that makes you feel like your skull is being crushed. It was impossible to concentrate on my work. Coding and debugging were out of the question. So I decided to take a break. I had heard about a room that was used as a nap room in the past, so I asked my boss if I could take a minute in that room, if it existed. It did exist, and my boss gave me the keys. Seemed a little weird that it was locked to me, but I guess that was because there were no longer any night shifts anymore. I was handed the key and I made my way to the basement. The air felt heavy and damp as I descended the stairs. The fluorescent lights were flickering above me. The building itself was very old. When I opened the door to the room, I was greeted by a strange, oppressive atmosphere. The room was small, and there was a bed in the middle of the floor, small and uncomfortable looking more like a hospital cot than a place to rest. The room had no windows, and the ceiling was low, making it feel quite claustrophobic. A box of tissues sat on the bed, and that was it. I locked the door behind me, laid down on the bed and tried to close my eyes, pulling the thin sheet over me to block out the world. My head ached, but I needed to rest. It was the only option. I tried to drift off, hoping that sleep would bring relief. An hour passed. I suddenly woke up, a sense of dread creeping over me. The room suddenly felt heavier now, and the air was thick and suffocating. Despite it being autumn, the room was humid, almost stifling. I could feel sweat on my skin as I lay there trying to make sense of the discomfort. Then I heard it. A strange, low sound. At first I thought it was my imagination, some part of my mind playing tricks on me, but it grew louder. It was a rhythmic sound, almost like the rasping of a breath, deep, heavy, and erratic. My heart started pounding in my chest. I lay completely still, trying to tell myself that this was nothing but the sound. It didn't stop. It came from somewhere in the room, somewhere in the corner, but I couldn't see where. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. No, this can't be happening, I thought. My body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed, stuck in place. The sound of ragged breathing grew louder, closer. The temperature in the room seemed to rise, making the air even thicker, more suffocating. And then I heard another sound, the unmistakable sound of a tissue being pulled from the box beside me. It was so sudden, sharp, and unnatural that it made my blood run cold. In that instant, the paralysis lifted. I could move again, but my body felt weak, like it was made of stone. I quickly pushed myself to sit up, my eyes darting around the room. The air had cleared, but my mind raced, trying to make sense of what just happened. I counted a few minutes in silence, waiting, terrified to look anywhere but the door. I decided I couldn't stay in that room any longer, no matter how tired I felt. My instincts screamed at me to leave. I hurriedly stood up, rushed towards the door, but as I reached for the handle, my eyes caught something on the floor. Something that hadn't been there when I came in. A crumpled up tissue. I froze. It looked like a tissue from the box that had been on the bed, the one I had been resting beside. But it wasn't just any tissue. It was the one I heard being pulled from the box. I hadn't moved from the bed. I had locked the door behind me and no one entered. How? A cold chill ran down my spine at that realization. The room wasn't just strange, it was haunted. Something had been in there with me, something that shouldn't have been. My mind raced as I imagined the details of what happened. Something had been watching me, something that knew I was alone, vulnerable. I scrabbled to get the door unlocked and then I bolted out of the room, rushing back to my desk. My heart was pounding in my chest and I could barely breathe. I was shaking, unable to calm myself. What the hell just happened? A few days later, I spoke to one of the older employees about what had happened. He was someone who knew a lot about the company's history and its secrets. At first he laughed it off, suggesting that it was a prank or a coincidence, but then his tone shifted as he told me something that scared me deep down. Well, there's this story of a former manager who died of overwork while on the night shift. He passed away in the basement near the stairwell where you went down. Some employees say that they've heard noises down there at night, and some say they've even seen him too. He went on to explain that young female employees were the ones who often ended up in that rest area, experiencing headaches, dizziness, and nausea, symptoms of stress, no doubt, but ones who seemed to trigger something darker in that part of the building. It made sense because at the time I was a young female employee too. As I pressed him for more details, he said something that still gives me the chills today. And the tissues. They've always been there. Always. No one knows why. That was the last straw. I had worked at that company long enough to understand its dark underbelly. Long hours, high pressure, and the complete disregard for employee health and well-being. This wasn't just a poorly managed company, it was a black company in every sense of the term, where employees were pushed to the brink and ignored when they broke. Now, the sight of that crumpled up tissue, the sound of something breathing in that room with me, has never left me. I don't know if it was the ghost of an overworked manager, or something even darker lurking in that basement, feeding on the stress and exhaustion of employees. But I know one thing. I never ever went near that room again. And I still wonder to this day how many others had felt the same fear before me. And I wonder if other female employees will experience what I did down there. This happened at my old workplace. There was this one time when I ran into serious trouble with a client, and it escalated to a point where I felt completely helpless. Normally in situations like that, I'd call up a senior colleague to help me out, someone who's been around long enough to know the ropes. I did the same that time. But when I called him, his voice was strange. It sounded muffled, almost as if he were talking through a blanket. I could barely make out what he was saying. He mentioned that he wasn't feeling very well, but didn't go into specifics. Despite his condition, he was still able to guide me through this situation, and with his help, I managed to resolve the issue. Afterward, when I returned to the office, everything felt off. It was chaotic, like the place was in a frenzy. I asked around to find out what was going on, and what I heard made my stomach drop. Apparently, my senior had jumped from the roof of a nearby department store, ultimately taking his own life. They said they even had footage from the surveillance cameras, which clearly showed him falling. His phone had survived the impact, though it had been damaged, and when they checked the call history, they found that our conversation was the final one he had. But here's the real kicker: the time he jumped. It was only 5 minutes after I hung up the phone with him. Of course, there's a chance that his phone had somehow been affected by the fall, causing the call log to show up after the fact, but still I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It's a true story, but to be honest, there's nothing that really scares me about it. Or at least, that's what I try to convince myself of. Anyway, things got weirder after that. At my office, this was a national company with offices all over the country, they imposed a strict silence about the whole incident. A gag order. No one was allowed to talk about it. If you asked about the funeral or burial site, you were told, "You don't need to know." The very next day, they deleted his company accounts, erased all traces of his existence. They cleared out his desk and the computer he had used. Then they trashed everything. They threw it all away. Within a week, a brand new desk and PC arrived to replace his. Some of his belongings were given to his family, but most of it was disposed of. Even a company newsletter that had a photo of him was thrown away. It was like he had never existed at all. Like they were intentionally trying to systematically erase him. When I tried to bring him up, the conversation would abruptly get cut off. Like I was talking about someone who never existed. I even mentioned it to a colleague at a different office, thinking maybe I could get some closure, but it wasn't long before I got called into a meeting with one of the big bosses. I got some nonsensical lecture about maintaining discretion, which made me even more suspicious about the whole situation. I eventually left that company because of all that weirdness. But the whole thing still haunts me. You know, the scariest part isn't what happened to him, but how people just sweep things under the rug when they don't want anyone to know. The company we worked for was actually pretty well known, so much so that if the truth ever got out, it would cause serious damage to their reputation. So maybe that's why they handled everything so strangely. But there's this still nagging thought in the back of my mind that forces me to ask myself this question. What if he wasn't really the one who decided to end it all? I don't know, but the more I think about it, the more unsettling it feels. Something wasn't right about that whole situation. Maybe in some twisted way, it was easier for them to pretend he never existed than to face the truth about what really happened. Hi, Jay here. I just want to share with you a few afterthoughts from the commenters. Number 1. It sounds like your senior had enough of that toxic black company. It's heartbreaking to think that the pressure from those awful working conditions could have driven him to that point. What a horrible company to work for. Comment 2. What if your senior knew too much? Maybe he accidentally stumbled upon something that was meant to be kept secret, and they made it look like he took his own life to cover it up. What if he stumbled across something that the company needed to keep hidden at all costs? Maybe he was silenced, made to disappear like nothing more than a forgotten employee. Who knows what companies are capable of, especially when they're protecting their own interests. Comment number 3. What could they have been hiding? The whole company seemed to go into overdrive to make sure that your senior's death didn't come into light. It's almost like they had something to lose if anyone found out the truth. Comment 4. That's the thing, right? The senior seemed like a caring, genuine person. There's no way he'd just suddenly decide to end his life. It's clear that something fishy was going on. The company probably swept it under the rug to avoid any kind of scandal. Comment number 5. This sounds like a cover-up. I bet the senior knew something about the company's dark side, something that would ruin them if it ever came out. And the fact that the company was so eager to dispose of all of his belongings, like he was never there, makes it even more suspicious. They just wanted to erase all evidence of him. And the final comment, number 6. If you knew things were wrong, why didn't you do something when you had the chance? You could have at least let people know what you knew. But I get it. It's hard to fight something that powerful. You might have just been trying to stay out of it. About 20 years ago, I had an unsettling experience while working at a factory in Hokkaido. The factory, located in an industrial park near the harbor, manufactured animal feed and served as a subcontractor for a large corporation. It was isolated, sitting apart from other businesses, and the work schedule was grueling, 6 days a week, with long hours and mandatory overtime. The normal working hours were from 8:40 a.m. to 5:30. We worked 6 days a week, Monday to Saturday, with alternating shifts with overtime. Overtime hours were from 5:30 to 9 p.m. Even during my prohibition period, I could feel the relentless pace of the job looming over me. My department's task was straightforward but brutal. Heavy manual labor, involving lifting, moving, and stacking weighty materials all day. Men and women worked side by side, but I often wondered how the women endured such back-breaking conditions. Still, I chalked it up to me being new. By June, the cracks began to show. One of the women in our team started taking frequent sick days, and soon after another followed. The air quality here is terrible, even with ventilation, our supervisor said, with a look of resignation one day. And with summer heat picking up, it's no wonder people are getting sick. I understood what he meant. My own body felt heavy and tired. Exhaustion seemed to snowball day after day. July arrived, bringing a week-long cleaning period, Monday to Saturday. My team was assigned to clean the 3rd floor of the factory, a place I had never been to before, but I knew that the feed tanks were up there. The steep stairs left me winded just climbing them, and the area was coated in thick layers of dust and spiderwebs. Despite the blue skies outside, the 3rd floor remained dim, with us employees requiring artificial light to work. An hour into cleaning, and I felt an inexplicable wave of fatigue. My arms and legs felt like lead. Thinking it might be heat exhaustion, I took a break, and the sensation passed as suddenly as it came. But later that day, it returned, accompanied by a strange weight pressing on my back, as if someone had climbed onto me, their full body pressing down, like I was giving someone a piggyback, or someone had jumped up and put their hands on my shoulders to support their weight. Startled, I sank to the ground and sat down. Over the next few days, the same thing happened intermittently. A heavy, human-like weight would press down on me, then vanish as quickly as it came. I began to wonder if I was overworked or losing my mind. When the cleaning period ended, the strange episode stopped, and my work life returned to its grueling routine. By August, I had successfully passed the prohibition period, and I was added to the night shift rota. This meant long hours of hard labor, followed by overtime cleaning those massive feed tanks on the 3rd floor. The tanks required us to descend into their depths via rope ladders and scrape away the dried residue inside, a task made miserable by the heat, tight spaces, and poor air circulation. If it wasn't bad enough, let me tell you, there was basically no steady place to get a foothold in those tanks. My muscles ached from constantly trying to keep my balance. We would work in teams of 4 or 5 to clean the tanks. One evening during a break, a colleague brought up an eerie rumor. They say people have seen a woman wandering the 3rd floor, he said, his voice low. Some even claim to hear her voice. another added. My stomach churned. Memories of the oppressive weight that I had felt during the cleaning period flashed in my mind. Could it be connected? I dismissed the thought, not wanting to dwell on it. I did wonder if this presence could be the reason why some staff members were out sick so regularly. I knew of at least 2 women who had been off work last month. A few days later, while working on the first floor just before lunch, I heard it. A woman's voice, faint but distinct. I couldn't make out what was being said though. I spun around, but none of my female co-workers seemed to be addressing me. They were all busy with their tasks. Then the voice came again, clearer this time. One of the women near me froze, her eyes wide. She looked at me and asked, "Did you hear that?" I nodded. My throat was dry. But when we asked around, no one else claimed to have heard it. But we heard it though. That evening I tried to focus on my tasks on the 3rd floor. The rumor of the ghostly woman now felt uncomfortably real. I have always been frightened by the paranormal, and as soon as someone mentioned a potential haunting, there was no way that I wasn't going to obsess over it. When the sun went down, I headed to the 3rd floor to begin my overtime. Late into the night, I was sweating as I was trying to scrub away some of the hardened residue inside the tank. Once done with that, my next task was to clean the outside of the tanks. It was at that point that I realized that I was alone. The rest of the team had already moved on to the 1st floor. Gathering my tools, I stood up and then froze. That same suffocating weight pressed down on my back. My knees buckled, and I leaned forward, struggling to stay upright. Then I felt something thin and tight wrapping around my neck, like a rope being pulled tighter and tighter. I tried to scream, but only a guttural gasp escaped me. My vision began to blur as my airways constricted, and then I felt hair, long strands of cold, damp hair brushing against my neck and face. Something pressed against my back, as if a head were leaning into me. I gathered every ounce of strength and slowly twisted my body to look behind me. What I saw froze my blood. A woman with long dark hair loomed over me, but her face, it had no features, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a blank, pale surface. I must have passed out, because the next thing I remember was a colleague shaking me awake. I was lying face down, surrounded by my scattered tools. My neck ached, and when I touched it, I felt a lingering tightness. Someone handed me a compact mirror, and I saw faint marks around my throat and strands of long black hair stuck to my skin. I remember the looks on the faces of my co-workers, seeing them stare at me with shock and fear in the dark of that warehouse is forever burned into my memories. It was too much for me. I left the factory soon after, without giving notice. I couldn't face that place or the memories of what had happened there. To this day, I don't know what I encountered on the 3rd floor, and I don't really want to know. Whatever it was, it's something I never want to face again. This story comes from Satoshi, a freelance writer who frequently works with the company I'm employed at. He's a friend of mine, and he's allowed me to put this online. Satoshi used to work as a newspaper reporter, but eventually left the field to pursue a career as a freelance journalist. He was passionate about his work, especially when it came to covering societal issues. His transition into freelancing gave him more freedom to write the way he wanted, but it also came with the downside of an unstable income. His financial situation had worsened significantly after leaving the paper, but he kept pressing on, trying to cut corners wherever he could, while still delivering quality work. Then one day, Satoshi's beloved personal computer broke down. He called me, obviously stressed about the unexpected cost of replacing it, In response, I suggested, if you're not picky about specs, then maybe you should buy a second-hand business computer. I knew that Satoshi didn't have any particular attachment to his computer's specifications. For him, it was just a tool to get the job done, something to write his articles on. Following my advice, he bought a used computer from the company I work for. It was a business-class PC, previously used in the office, but it had decent enough specs for his needs. Satoshi lived in a modest one-room apartment, a small 1K unit, essentially a tiny space with a kitchen and one bedroom. It wasn't much, but he was particular about one thing: the view. He loved high floors and often rented apartments on the top levels of buildings. At the time, he was on the 5th floor of a building. It wasn't some luxurious tower apartment, but from the window, you could see a decent stretch of the city. I've been there before, and I remember him bragging about it. As someone who's afraid of heights, I couldn't understand the appeal, but to him it was everything. The curtains were cheap and thin, so when night fell you could easily make out the shape of the room from the outside. It wasn't exactly the most private setup, but he didn't mind. I guess as a journalist he liked to keep his eyes on the city below, or it gave him inspiration. One evening at around 10 p.m, Satoshi decided to grab a late dinner at a nearby ramen shop. When he looked up at the building on his way back, he saw a light coming from his apartment. At first he thought nothing of it. It wasn't the usual soft light of a lamp, it was a bright, almost TV-like glow spilling from his window. Did I leave the computer on? He wondered. He was sure he'd shut it down before leaving. But when he reached his apartment, he was surprised to find the computer running. The monitor lit up the room, casting an eerie blue glow. Shrugging it off as an accidental restart, he turned his PC off and went to bed, his tiredness outweighing his curiosity. Around 2 a.m, he woke up, slowly opening his eyes, feeling a presence in the room. When he fully opened his eyes, he saw the computer screen was still on, and sitting in front of it, in his chair, was a woman. She had long hair. She was dressed in what looked like office workers' attire. Am I dreaming? He wondered, still half asleep. But then he heard her whispering. He swears that he heard her say in a faint voice, "Open it, open it." Satoshi couldn't move. His body felt paralyzed, as though something was holding him down, preventing him from speaking or even screaming. The woman slowly stood up and began gliding toward him from across the room, her voice growing louder, repeating the same words, "Open it, open it." As she came closer, his fear deepened, but he was still frozen, unable to respond in any way. The woman moved right next to him, her breath warm on his ear, as she whispered, "Open it, open it." When he finally awoke the next morning, the computer was still on. He was dazed and unsure whether or not what happened was a nightmare or was real. But as he got closer to the computer, he remembered her words. The woman's plea kept echoing in his mind. He didn't really understand it at first, but then he noticed something strange. Inside one of the folders on the computer, there were several work reports in a folder, which was simply a woman's name. Could it have been the name of the woman who appeared the night before? The reports seemed to belong to her. He was shocked as he read through the files. She had worked for a well-known subcontracting company that our company worked in tandem with, and what he uncovered was horrifying. The woman had been forced to work over 200 hours of overtime each month, an unimaginable amount of stress and exhaustion. He couldn't shake the feeling that what he'd experienced the night before wasn't just a dream, but the lingering presence of a woman who had died from overwork. A tragic, unfinished soul still caught in the remnants of her suffering. It dawned on us at different times that when he bought the laptop from my company's IT department, whoever sold it to him hadn't bothered to wipe the hard drive. She was still there, trapped digitally. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Satoshi began investigating further. The story he uncovered was tragic. He ended up writing a feature about it, and the piece garnered a lot of attention. though to avoid complications, the details were slightly altered in the published version. The real catalyst for the story, of course, was an anonymous whistleblower, someone within the company who couldn't remain silent any longer. The fact that that woman's work laptop had been sold without erasing the data, and it ended up in Satoshi's hands, someone who had previously worked in social journalism, seemed like a twist of fate. But to me, it felt like more than that. It felt deliberate, as though the universe had conspired to reveal the injustice and suffering this woman had endured. Before the article was published, Satoshi and I went to visit her grave. We couldn't say for sure how much we truly understood her pain, but we promised her that we would expose the truth and make sure her story was heard. We told her that she could finally rest in peace, and I believe in my heart that she heard us. Since then, Satoshi hasn't had any further encounters with her at the computer, and I hope that means she has found some peace.